Hi, everybody. I'm Claudia Silk. I'm an adult services librarian here at Fairfield Public Library. Very thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Raidbard. He's an athletic director at the University of Hartford. He coached basketball for Western New Mexico University, Dartmouth, Florida Gulf Coast, and Chicago State University. His book, Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches, is designed to help athletic coaches at all levels of sports learn about leadership practice and teach them to become more intentional and effective leaders for their athletes and teams. So without further ado, here is Matthew. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Claudia, and thank you so much to the library for having me. Really excited. Thank you so much to everybody for hopping on and spending some time with us tonight. I hope you learn something, get something out of the presentation. So I have spent my entire professional career as a men's college basketball coach, college athletics administrator, and my background, educational background, is in leadership. I have both my master's and doctorate in educational leadership, and it was really the research that I conducted while trying to obtain my doctorate that was on athletic coach leadership practice that ended up being the inspiration for the book, Lead Like a Pro. So I like to start off every time I'm talking to a group or doing a seminar or workshop presentation, anything, with a story about how I actually got into leadership and how I, started to understand the importance of leadership practice for coaches. It was always my dream to be a college basketball coach. That's all I ever wanted to do growing up. I love the time that we're in right now, March Madness, the NCAA tournament. All I wanted was to be a college basketball coach. So when I was getting ready to graduate from my undergrad at Indiana University, I decided there was no better time than the present to pursue that dream. But my problem was I wasn't a student athlete. I had no connections to any college coaches, no family members, friends, nothing. So I just started, emailing and calling and applying for jobs. And I got really fortunate to get my first college coaching job as an assistant coach at a small Division II school down in the southwest corner of New Mexico, Western New Mexico University. And I was really excited to get the job and just live my dream. But before I could accept, I had to also be enrolled in a graduate program. I really wasn't interested in graduate school. I hadn't thought much about it, but if that's what I had to do in order to accept the job, then I was going to be in graduate school. So I quickly bought a book and studied, took the GREs, sent my transcripts, applied, did everything I needed to do. And fortunately, I was accepted into a master's program. And I'll never forget, I was so excited to be a college basketball coach and be living my dream that, going to graduate school was secondary. It was just something that I had to do as a means to an end. But when I got there, I remember my first day, my head coach was walking me around, introducing me to everybody. And then he took me to lunch. And then after lunch, I went to go meet with my graduate advisor to pick a program. And when I got there, the first thing she told me was, because my undergraduate degree was in history and classical studies, so nothing very applicable to what I'd be doing in coaching, that there are only two graduate programs that I could realistically get into and complete. One was counseling and one was educational leadership. And I really didn't care which one I did. I just wanted to be in a program. So we put the two programs, the description side by side, and we just did a pros and cons of both. And as we went through, I could see how both could be applicable to me in coaching and be beneficial. But there wasn't much to kind of distinguish which one would be better for me until we got to the end, which was timeline to graduation. And educational leadership was 2 falls, 2 springs, and you graduate. And counseling was exactly the same, except in the middle, it required an additional 6-hour summer internship. So based off of that fact, I chose educational leadership. And I had no idea the impact that decision would have, not only on my immediate coaching career and moving into administration, eventually going back to school to pursue a doctorate, writing a book, working with coaches to help them develop their leadership practice. But I was so fortunate to have that opportunity to be exposed to leadership practice and really understand the importance of it early on in my coaching career. And that was a big inspiration for wanting to eventually, when I wrote the book, help coaches with their leadership practice, give them resources, tools, knowledge to be able to be better and more effective leaders. So the main thesis of the book, and really everything that I kind of talk about and base my work on, is the idea that coaches are leaders. And one of the big things that I get from coaches at different levels of sports, and I'm so glad that so many people put their level of sport in the chat, and that we have a really wide range of age groups and sports, and that's really fantastic. But one of the things I get from a lot of coaches is this idea that professional coaches, college coaches, if it's your full-time job to be a coach, then you're a leader. But if you're a high school coach who's also a teacher, if you're a rec sports coach, if you're a youth sports coach who's coaching your son or daughter's team for a few hours a week, that you're a leader, but it's different. And what I want to say up front, and what I keep harping on, is that all coaches are leaders. It doesn't matter what level you coach, how competitive it is, how many hours you put into it during the week, if it's just your hobby or you're coaching your child's team for fun, or if it's your full-time job, you are a leader. And all of the leadership decisions, all the decisions you make for your athletes and team are leadership decisions. And that's kind of the second big thing that I get from a lot of coaches. And I get this a lot from college coaches, which is this idea that, really big decisions that have kind of the most weight or bearing on outcomes, who coaches, what athletes coaches play at the end of the games, what they emphasize at practice, elements of strategy or X's and O's, what play they run with the game on the line. Those really big decisions are leadership decisions, because they have a huge impact on what is a huge goal for coaches, winning and losing. But what I tell coaches is all of your decisions that affect your athletes and team, both large and small, are leadership decisions, and you should put weight on every single one of them. Cumulatively, a lot of small leadership decisions that you make over the course of the season can have big impacts, not only on winning or losing, which isn't the only objective or outcome for coaches, but on the experience of your athletes, whether or not they have fun and enjoy being members of the team, whether or not they want to come back the following year, or they're retained, or they want to go somewhere else. And that's not just your individual leadership decisions, like what you emphasize at practice, or who you start at the beginning of games. That's about how you communicate. Do you have a really direct communication style? You talk to kids a lot one-on-one, or do you do it more in a big group? Do you just you yell things across the field? You do things more in the huddle? Neither is right or wrong. Ultimately, what you do, though, is going to have a different impact on each of your kids. Some kids don't respond that well when coaches talk to them in a big group, particularly if they're giving a correction, right? They prefer that one-on-one kind of individual consideration. So if kids that are maybe more sensitive, don't have as much confidence, just prefer that kind of leadership behavior of one-on-one communication, if you're consistently giving them corrections in a big group, that may be difficult for them to hear. It may hurt their self-esteem. It might hurt your relationship. So that should be an intentional leadership decision that a coach makes, how they communicate. And then a coach should then adjust their communication style based on the needs of their athletes. And that's about really looking intentionally at every decision you make being a leadership decision. And that's why coaches need leadership education and training. Coaches today at all levels of sports, they're asked to take on more roles and more leadership responsibilities for their athletes and teams than ever before. I felt it year after year that I was in college coaching, that every year I was asked to wear more hats as a leader. When I first took that college job at Western Mexico University, I was living in Chicago at the time, and I moved from Chicago to Western New Mexico. I drove with the very few things that I had at the time, and it's about 1,600 miles. It took me about 24 hours to make that drive. And I remember the whole time thinking just about how amazing it was that I was going to be a college basketball coach, that I was going to be spending a majority of my time on X's and O's, workouts, coaching games in practice, recruiting, breaking down film. That was going to be a majority of my job. And I'll never forget, I was down at working in Silver City for about a month, and I was talking to my dad, and he asked me how things were going. I told him everything was great. I loved the community and the campus, my other coaches in the athletic department. I loved our team. I thought we were going to be really good. It was so much fun working with them. But I just didn't understand when I was going to get the chance to do all of those basketball roles and responsibilities that I thought were going to be so central to my job. I was spending that majority of my time I thought would be on basketball responsibilities. I was spending that time wearing a multitude of other hats, doing a variety of different roles. I was a study hall monitor, a class checker, a chauffeur, a nutritionist, a strength and conditioning coach, a mentor, a friend. I was wearing all of these other hats that were all important. Each one-on-one, each individually was important to the individual student athletes that I was working with, but also cumulatively, they had a big positive or negative impact depending on how I handled myself in each of those roles. The problem for me and for a lot of coaches is when we're asked to wear all these different hats, it requires a very nuanced and very intentional leadership style and practice. Because not, how I gave corrections to my athletes on the court, I was very confident in that. I felt like I knew how to give corrections. I always felt, for me, trying to do one-on-one, just look each other in the eye, talk it through. This is what I need you to do. This is what we need to fix. I felt very confident doing that. But when I was asked to then take on another role off the court and have a difficult conversation with one of my athletes who was missing class or not turning in assignments, that required a potentially different set of leadership skills, leadership tools that I didn't necessarily have. And even if I felt like I kind of did instinctually, I didn't have much experience in them. And that was a problem that I was running into early on that a lot of coaches run into, is we're asked to be leaders in all of these different roles for our athletes at various times. And sometimes they can be conflicting. Having a hard conversation on the court, having a hard conversation off the court, you may approach those two different ways without even meaning to, right? Because you're asked to be in these two opposing situations. And so, again, it goes back to just trying to give coaches as much tools and knowledge and resources to be able to take on all of these different roles and responsibilities that they're asked to for their athletes and teams. So a lot of what I talk about in the book, and this comes from my research, is the idea of a leadership gap. And what the leadership gap refers to is the kind of gap between the leader a coach wants to be or thinks they are and the leader that they actually are, right? There's a gap, there's a disconnect between the leader the coach wants to be and the leader that's kind of coming out on the court or on the field. And, for coaches that are new or young or having inconsistent results or have hit a plateau and aren't seemingly able to kind of get to the next level or step with their team, that level of success, oftentimes it's due to this leadership gap. A big part of what makes the most successful coaches great is that they've figured out what's the best leadership style and behaviors for them to practice. They've acquired the tools to practice them, and they've developed an understanding of who they are as a leader to such an extent that as the needs of their athletes change, they can change and evolve their leadership practice to keep up with the times. That's a huge part of what makes coaches successful. So when coaches have this leadership gap, it's a big part of what's keeping them from really being successful and effective leaders. And, from my research, that kind of is attributed to generally two things. One is just a lack of foundational leadership knowledge. What are different leadership styles? What are different leadership behaviors? What is my leadership practice? Every coach should be able to say, kind of in their elevator pitch, this is my leadership style. These are the key behaviors that are important to me as a leader. This is how I practice them. And, if coaches don't have foundational leadership knowledge, it's hard for them to go out and then be that leader that they want to be, right? The other reason for the leadership gap, it's usually more common, is not having the tools in your toolbox to be able to go out and practice the leadership style and behaviors that are best for you or that come naturally to you. This was my problem early on in my coaching career. I was fortunate to immediately, as soon as I took my first graduate class, start learning about different leadership styles. This is transformational leadership. This is servant leadership. This is democratic leadership. So I very quickly kind of figured out through acquiring that foundational leadership knowledge who I was as a leader or what came natural to me, what was important to me. I'm a very positive person. I believe in a lot of clear and direct communication. I believe it's my job as a coach to inspire and motivate my athletes to believe they can be more than they thought they could on their own, to achieve more than they thought they could on their own. I believe in building really strong relationships with my athletes that transcend the typical player-coach relationship. So kind of knowing those things about myself, knowing what came kind of instinctually to me as a leader and a coach, I was able to kind of figure out early on that transformational leadership, which a lot of those kind of traits that I just discussed for myself are really key elements. That was the kind of my foundational leadership style. My problem was that I knew I wanted to be a transformational leader. I knew I wanted to go out and be really uplifting and inspirational and motivational for my athletes. I just didn't have all the tools to do it. I knew that a really key component or really key tool that I could use was my communication. Being really positive and uplifting and optimistic, enthusiastic, encouraging. I had that tool. I understood that tool. The problem is that one tool for practicing any leadership behavior, no matter how powerful that tool is or how important it is not going to reach every kid. Every kid has different needs. Every kid's going to react differently. So for, let's say, half of my kids, that communication, that uplifting and positive inspirational motivation communication, that kind of met their need. And they started immediately accomplishing short-term goals and making progress towards long-term goals, because what I was giving them from a leadership perspective, the inspiration and motivation I was providing them, that was jump-starting them. They were inspired and motivated to go out and work hard and then keep going and going and going. For other kids, it didn't have that same effect. Some kids, it didn't really get through to at all. They just didn't really respond to it. Other kids, they responded some, but then once they hit some adversity, they kind of became discouraged. I needed another tool. I needed or two in my toolbox to be able to reach those kids, meet their needs. One tool that I would learn later on that was really powerful and effective for me as a leader in being able to reach more kids was the power of behavior modeling. Modeling determination and hard work and motivation, modeling those things for my kids to see became a really powerful inspirational tool. They saw how hard I was working, how much I was putting into it. And that, for some kids, inspired them who weren't necessarily reached by my communication style. So it was about having those different tools in my toolbox as a transformational leader to be able to reach more kids in a more effective way. So how do you determine the right leadership style for you? I break it down into 3 steps. The first step is reflect on and determine what are your personal values and beliefs as a leader. What comes naturally to you as a leader? What are your leadership instincts? For me, again, positivity, direct communication, inspiration and motivation, building relationships. I believe in putting the needs of my athletes first, which is a key characteristic of servant leadership. I try to incorporate the ideas, thoughts, and opinions of my athletes when making team decisions at different times in my coaching career. That's a very democratic leadership behavior. So, just reflecting on what was important to me as a coach, I was then, once I learned foundational leadership knowledge, learned about the key elements of transformational leadership, and realized that they aligned with several of my leadership values and beliefs. So that became kind of my foundational leadership style. Learning about servant leadership and democratic leadership and key characteristics of those that I can incorporate into my leadership practice. That was how I built my leadership practice and determined what was right for me. And then the last step was acquiring those tools, like I talked about, to be able to go out and effectively practice that leadership style. How to be able to go out in a genuine, thoughtful way and get the opinions, thoughts, and ideas of my athletes so that I can make more informed team decisions while also increasing their buy-in. How do I do that in a meaningful way? Not just, what do you guys think of this? Okay, let's move on. That's not going to generate the same buy-in as a democratic leader than somebody who's doing it in a more thoughtful way, right? Same thing with other key leadership behaviors, the inspiration, motivating, building relationships. What were the tools I was using to build relationships, right? One really powerful tool that I use to try to build strong relationships as a transformational leader was whenever I saw my athletes on campus, whenever they came to my office, whenever they showed up to practice, I tried as much as possible, the first thing I said to them to have nothing to do with basketball. I always tried to start it off with a question or a comment about something that, again, had nothing to do with basketball or the team. How's your family doing? How's class going? Have you seen this movie? Can you believe the weather? I just wanted to establish, first and foremost, we weren't player coach. We were just 2 people. And ultimately, I trust and respect you. I want you to trust and respect me. And this isn't about just what you do on the court. This is so much bigger than that. but that was a tool I had to acquire over time and understand how to do in a meaningful way. Again, I couldn't just casually say, well, how's everything going? Oh, okay, great. Now let's talk about basketball. I had to be genuine. I had to show an interest. I had to be willing to talk about things about myself, give my opinions, share parts of myself so that it was a two-way street and we built a genuine relationship. But all of those tools come from experience. They come from observation. And then obviously, they come from, resources on leadership that, like I'm trying to do, help coaches kind of build their leadership practice. So the other part of that is that every leader and leadership style is unique. Every coach has a different belief system and set of personal values, communication style, personality, background, upbringing, set of experiences that all contribute to our leadership style, our values, and then ultimately how those come out, how those are projected to our athletes. Me as a transformational leader and you as a transformational leader, we could have kind of the carbon blueprints of, our leadership styles. They could be exactly the same, our same key behaviors, same belief systems. They're still going to look different. They're still going to come off different because of our communication styles, our backgrounds, our experiences. So there's no perfect leadership style, or there's no one leadership style I could tell any coach to practice that would have them be successful. It's all about finding your unique leadership style that aligns with your personal values and beliefs. And that's why, a very common mistake that a lot of coaches make, I made it early in my career, was this idea that, to build my kind of leadership practice, I'm going to kind of watch and really study and observe what the most successful coaches are doing. And I'm going to do that. And that's really going to help make me successful, because you combine that with my basketball brilliance, I'm going to be the next Coach K, right? The problem was that I'm not them. Their leadership values and beliefs are different than mine. And the leadership style that's right for them is ultimately not necessarily right for me, or elements of it are not right for me. So I'm going to be holding myself back as a leader, just trying to emulate what they're doing instead of figuring out what's actually right for me. Now, it's not to say that, important lessons can't be learned from observing other coaches. They certainly can. I've learned a lot of important tools and techniques and tips from watching, observing other coaches and talking to them. That's a part of the process. But just emulating, thinking that's going to work for me is a mistake a lot of coaches make. And ultimately, it's about figuring out what's right for you, not about just emulating what is right for other successful coaches. And then, as a coach, even though the kind of foundation of my leadership practice is transformational leadership, I incorporate other kind of key behaviors of other leadership styles like servant leadership, democratic leadership, and it's very common for coaches to practice, several different leadership styles to kind of build their unique leadership practice. You may find, as we're kind of talking through leadership styles coming up here in the next few slides, that there's one leadership style like transformational leadership for me that really speaks to you. And maybe that's your foundational leadership style. But if you don't, and there are 3 or 4 different leadership styles that you kind of take one behavior from each to build your unique practice, that's great too. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Ultimately, nobody practices just one leadership style. There's always going to be elements of different leadership styles that come into your unique practice. And then what this ultimately is helping every coach do is to kind of get that deep understanding of what their leadership style is and the tools to go out and practice it, so that as the needs of their kids, which are changing and evolving at a rapid pace, faster and faster every year, coaches have an opportunity to best meet those evolving and changing needs by being able to make adjustments to their leadership practice as they go. So all this comes down to helping coaches make intentional leadership choices. And what that means is all the choices that you make to get you from these questions and others to ultimately what your answers are, which are your goals or objectives. So start by asking yourself these questions, right? What are your responsibilities as a leader? What's important to you as a leader? What are your goals for the team? The answers that you give to these questions are going to be what your intentional leadership choices should be moving you towards. For example, as a coach, as a college coach, I always wanted my athletes to have a great experience. As a coach, when I coach my 4-year-old soccer team in the fall, I'm going to want everybody to have fun. Whatever level you're at, whatever you call it, right? That's always a primary goal of coaches. Have a great experience, have fun. So now as a coach who understands my leadership style, who has the tools to practice it, now I can make intentional leadership choices to move me towards helping my kids have as much fun or a great experience as possible. So what are some intentional leadership choices I can make to do that? And what are the tools I could use to really enact those in a meaningful way? I could try individual consideration, a strong transformational leadership behavior, where I'm going to decide the tool I'm going to use is I'm going to show up to practice early. I'm going to greet every kid one-on-one, give them a high five, try to start practice off on a high note. During practice, I'm going to try whenever possible to give corrections one-on-one to really build that relationship of trust and respect. And then at the end of practice, I'm going to end every practice with a game so everybody leaves on a high note having fun. So those are intentional leadership choices reflective of who I am as a transformational leader, embodying my personal values and beliefs that are going to hopefully move me towards the goal of all of my kids having fun. So in the next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk through some different leadership styles that are great for coaches to practice. And hopefully within these styles, you'll see one or more key behaviors that speak to you as a leader that are part of your leadership practice. And you can kind of build what your unique leadership practice is from kind of picking out these key behaviors that are reflective of who you are as a leader. So the first leadership style is transformational leadership. That's a really important leadership style to me. It's the leadership style that research shows is the most commonly practiced leadership style by coaches. It's also the leadership style that research shows athletes say that they respond best to. That doesn't mean that if we're talking through the transformational leadership behaviors and they don't really speak to you, or maybe only one element does, there's nothing wrong with that. Not every successful coach is a transformational leader, and not every transformational leader is a successful coach. It's just a very common leadership style because it embodies inspirational motivation, which for a lot of coaches is a key component of their leadership practice and their core values and beliefs. Not every coach, and it's not right or wrong to have that. It's just very common for a lot of coaches. And that's a big reason why a lot of coaches are transformation leaders or practice elements of transformational leadership. It's about working to inspire confidence, motivation, and purpose in your athletes. Inspiring confidence and a sense of purpose are really powerful, inspirational, and motivational tools that coaches can use. I think sometimes as transformation leaders, we get caught up in kind of optimistic, uplifting, positive, encouraging language, which is very important. Those are very important tools for transformational leaders. But inspiring confidence and a sense of purpose in your athletes are extremely powerful tools for transformational leaders. Building up your athletes' confidence and pouring your confidence that you have into them, that's very powerful as an inspirational and motivational factor. Same thing with instilling a sense of purpose in your athletes. This is your role on the team. This is why it's important. This is why we need you and why we need everybody to really be a sum that's greater than all of this team's parts, to really achieve all of our goals and reach our potential as a team. Instilling that sense of purpose in your athletes, again, is very powerful. It gets buy-in. It builds a strong relationship. It builds that trust athletes have in you because you're giving them your confidence. You're giving them that sense of purpose, or you're helping them to see and discover it. Those are really powerful tools that you could use as transformational leaders to inspire and motivate your athletes. It's also about having a clear, positive, and direct communication style. One tool that I really used was not only did I try to give corrections whenever possible one-on-one to my athletes, I always found that generally my athletes responded better to corrections one-on-one whenever possible. But for my athletes who I felt like didn't take correction very well, maybe they didn't have a lot of confidence and I was trying to build it up, maybe I felt like they were a little sensitive to corrections. A tool that I used in those circumstances to kind of best meet the needs of those kids was I would try to use we whenever possible. We're going to fix this. We're going to turn this around. We're going to get there. We're going to make this change. We're going to figure this out together. I always felt like when I did that, it lessened the correction. The athlete only received kind of 50% because I was taking the other 50%. We were in this together. We were going to figure this out. And for my athletes who kind of needed that little bit of extra support, I felt like that was a really important tool for being able to meet their needs, as opposed to just saying, I'm just going to give my corrections one-on-one to every athlete. Well, again, some athletes need something a little different than others. And that was kind of an adjustment I made to my leadership practice to be able to best meet their needs by using kind of a different transformational leadership tool. Transformational leaders also, really work to enhance the strengths of their athletes while masking their weaknesses. But one thing that's really important about that is, that kind of play to your strengths, mask your weaknesses is don't forget to be constantly trying to help your athletes turn those weaknesses into strengths. What that does is it builds the confidence of your athletes. It gives them a sense of purpose, that ability to improve, that desire for improvement or betterment. But it also raises the floor of your team. There's only so much playing to your athlete's strengths that you can do over the course of the season. But by developing your athlete's weaknesses into, closer to strengths or hopefully to strengths, now you've got a lot more strengths to play to and a lot less weaknesses to mask. So just as a transformational leader, really try to think about that and how you can really work to improve your athletes' weaknesses, try to make them more become strengths. Again, that also will help with their confidence and help with their sense of purpose as well. And then transformational leadership is also about that communication style that I talked about before, showing really strong support of your athletes, investment in their improvement, their learning, growth, and development, taking an optimistic approach and displaying enthusiasm for their successes is all really important as a transformational leader. So the next leadership style I'll talk about is servant leadership. I really believe that everybody who makes the decision to be a coach, at least in some small way, is practicing servant leadership. Because the really key element of servant leadership is putting the needs of your athletes and team above everything else. And if you make the decision to be a coach, you're really showing up to try to help your athletes and team improve, come together, build a strong culture, believe in one another, develop their abilities on and off the court. Those are very strong servant leadership characteristics. So I think that at least in some small extent, and probably more so, a lot of coaches practice servant leadership. Really powerful tools for servant leadership is behavior modeling. Modeling really great behaviors like unselfishness, empathy, teamwork, inclusion, listening. What servant leaders do is, they pick out these and other great behaviors and they model how they want their athletes to act them out. As a coach, I look everybody in the eye who's talking to me. I expect my athletes to look me in the eye when I'm talking to them. As a coach, I get feedback from my assistants. I work really closely with them. I incorporate kind of the team into what we're doing. I let them in on how we're making decisions. I really try to build that team chemistry and teamwork. I expect my athletes to do that as well. I expect them to communicate and kind of be one with one another. It's about modeling those really great behaviors that your athletes can see you doing and then go and kind of, to an extent, emulate their version of. Same thing with giving kind of corrections to your athletes. Servant leaders model how they expect their athletes to give each other corrections, in a constructive way. That starts with how the coach does it. It's really behavior focused as a servant leader. And then the last one, which I really want to pin down and talk about for a minute is, servant leaders work to develop and enhance the leadership abilities of all team members. And I think this is a really, really important leadership decision for coaches. And I really encourage you all to really think and reflect on it and consider trying to incorporate it into your leadership practice if it speaks to you at all. As coaches, I think it's very natural for us to be the leaders in all situations or in most situations. I call it filling the leadership vacuum. As coaches, it's our natural instinct when we see something great happen to want to praise it. Or when we see something go wrong to immediately want to correct it. And while that's very natural, I did that all the time as a coach. I think most coaches just instinctually do it. Just that's how we are as coaches. We see something great. We want to say it was great. Let's keep doing it. We see something wrong. We want to fix it so we can move on and improve. The problem with that is that as a coach, if you're always jumping into that leadership space immediately, you're not giving any room for your athletes to be able to move into that space and have an opportunity to develop their leadership abilities. Having an opportunity to praise their teammates or constructively correct their teammates, that's a very powerful way to enhance their leadership abilities. But if you as the coach are always doing it or immediately doing it or setting an expectation for how it's going to happen, then your athletes don't have a lot of space to develop their own leadership abilities. So a really important tool that I encourage you to use if this kind of speaks to you and you want to incorporate it into your leadership practice is really try to be intentional and thoughtful about when you're at practice, or a team activity and you see something great happen, give it a second. Don't immediately praise it. Give your athletes an opportunity to step into that space themselves and praise each other. Same thing if you're running through a play or a drill and something very obvious goes wrong. Don't immediately correct it. Give it a second. Give your athletes that opportunity to constructively correct each other, hopefully based on how you've modeled you want those corrections to look. Over time, your athletes will feel much more comfortable stepping into that space. They'll develop and enhance their leadership abilities, and they'll really help benefit your team because so much of the leadership won't have to come from you. It'll come from the athletes, which is really powerful leadership. If you're doing that and you're finding that none of your athletes are really comfortable jumping into that space, that's completely fine. Maybe you have a new team or a young team or a team that just, doesn't have a lot of strong leadership personalities or a lot of kids who have really taken on a strong leadership role before. That's totally fine. Try prompting them into that space. Something really great happened on that play. Who knows what it was? Or there was a mistake on this area of the court of the field. Who knows how we can fix it together? And I promise you that even though they're not saying it, you have kids who know the answer. They're just not comfortable going into that space yet. But over time, by prompting and encouraging them and continuously giving that space for them to take on a leadership role, they'll get more comfortable. And again, it'll really help your team because that leadership from kid to kid, from athlete to athlete is just so important to positive team culture and team camaraderie, teamwork. It really helps your team in a way that's profound when you don't always have to be the leader. The next leadership styles I'll talk about are very opposing leadership styles: democratic versus autocratic leadership. Democratic leadership is very much how it sounds. As a coach, before making team decisions, you're willing to listen and consider and value the input, thoughts, and ideas of all team members or of a group of team members. What this does is it builds a culture of really strong mutual trust and respect, because by giving your athletes the opportunity to contribute to team-related decisions, you're showing them how much you trust and value their opinions and their thoughts and ideas. That really helps to solicit buy-in, because now your kids are really invested in the decisions because they've played a role in making them, or they've contributed to making them in some way. So you can get buy-in from your team very quickly by being a democratic leader. A drawback, because there's always drawbacks to leadership styles, it's a slower, more deliberative approach to leadership, because you're always kind of asking people's thoughts and ideas and opinions, and then you're considering them before you make your final decision. Well, coaches don't always have that amount of time. Coaches have to make stressful and pressure-packed decisions, during games or practice or at various times. So even as a democratic leader, there are times when you have to kind of just venture more into the more autocratic side and use your knowledge, experiences, and your instincts to make team decisions. If you have to do that from time to time because of the situation, that doesn't mean you're no longer a democratic leader or you've compromised your democratic leadership style. It just means that as a leader, we have to be willing to adapt to the needs of situations. And democratic leadership is just not necessarily popular in every situation. And that's totally fine. I always kind of just caution coaches that while democratic leadership is a representative democracy, you're allowing your athletes to give their thoughts, opinions, and ideas on team decisions. It's not necessarily a voting democracy. As a coach, you're responsible for making team decisions and you're responsible for their outcomes. And you have to make decisions that you believe in that are reflective of what you think is best for the team. So if you get everybody's opinions on the team and you take a straw poll and it comes back 9-8, I would never tell you that you should just flip your decision and go with the majority. Again, you're the coach. You have to make the decision that's right for you. You may change your mind. Maybe you've been persuaded, or you may change, elements of your decision, and that's perfectly within your right. And, and that makes sense as a democratic leader. But you shouldn't necessarily just flip your decision and go with the majority. Now, if the straw poll comes back 17-2 and you're in the 2, I still would never tell a coach to just unilaterally change their decision. But I would say in that circumstance that it's probably a good idea to, get another opinion from a coach who you value, a mentor, a colleague, a friend who's, maybe a leader in a different area outside of sports, just to make sure you're looking at everything from all the right angles and you haven't overlooked a key element in the decision. And at that point, you may still decide to stick with your minority decision because that's what you're comfortable with and you believe is right. But in that circumstance, as a democratic leader, I would encourage you to maybe be transparent with your team about why you're sticking with that decision, even though it's such a minority opinion. You don't want you to lose buy-in from your kids and your credibility as a democratic leader because they think that, well, coach is asking us our opinions, but coach ultimately doesn't really care because he or she just stuck with what they wanted, even though it wasn't what anybody else on the team really wanted. The other leadership style, which is very opposing, is autocratic leadership. And autocratic leadership is leadership style that, kind of on its face, a lot of coaches can feel there's a negative connotation to being an autocratic leader, right? Because kind of autocratic leadership outside of the realm of sports, could oftentimes have a negative connotation. But looking at it within the context of sports and just looking at it within its key behaviors of what makes up an autocratic leader, it makes sense that coaches would gravitate towards autocratic leadership. It's a leadership style that's very structured. It's very hierarchical, top down. You're the coach at the top of the pyramid. You're limiting input from stakeholders on most, if not all, team decisions. And you're relying on your experiences, your knowledge, your instincts to make most, if not all, team decisions. And it makes sense. As a coach, again, you're hired to make team decisions and you're responsible for their outcomes. So if you, really feel strongly in your experiences and your knowledge, it makes sense that you'd want to rely heavily on yourself to make team decisions. Also, as an autocratic leader, you might have a vision for the team. You might have a series of goals that have worked in the past, a series of kind of things that you want the team to do over time to make progress, right? You have those things in your head. You have that vision, right? So some of your decisions are already made as an autocratic leader, and you don't want feedback because the decisions tie into one another. That's totally fine. Again, you're not always going to probably be an autocratic leader. Just like with democratic leadership, there may be times when you have to make a decision that's really outside of your knowledge base and experience. But as the coach, you have to make it. So you might get some opinions and be more democratic because that's going to best meet the needs of the situation or circumstances you find yourself in. Again, it doesn't mean that you're no longer an autocratic leader. It just means you're willing to be flexible and adapt your leadership practice so that you can make the best leadership decision. One thing that autocratic leaders kind of struggle with is getting buy-in from their team, right? Because you can't rely on incorporating their opinions to get that buy-in and build that trust and respect. So autocratic leaders get buy-in and build that relationship of trust and respect by making great decisions that move the team towards the accomplishment of short-term goals, long-term goals, improvement, success. Coaches make great decisions and athletes can see what those decisions are leading to. They can see the positive outcomes, the improvement, the success, the wins, the progress. Over time, that's what gets you buy-in and trust from your athletes. Because again, even your athletes who really want to contribute to team decisions, it's hard for them to not buy in when the team is successful based on the decisions that you're making. And then the last leadership style I'll talk about, which is a leadership style that, as I'm talking about it, I'm sure most, if not everyone, will kind of harken back to some coaches that they had when, they were playing sports, who were very strong transactional leaders. It's a leadership style that is not as common nowadays, but elements of it still are. And I do think that those elements can be effective when practiced in a certain way. First off, I think a lot, if not all, coaches do practice kind of a very key element, at least to some extent, of transactional leadership, which is setting clear standards and expectations up front. If you're a coach who has a beginning of the year meeting with your team and you give everybody your team rules and standards and expectations, that's a very transactional leadership behavior. That's you kind of setting those expectations up front. If you're late to three practices, you can't start the next game. That's a team rule, and it's very transactional. You do this, this is what happens, right? It's also based on a contingent rewards and punishment system for trying to inspire and motivate. This is where I think a lot of us will be familiar with transactional leadership. The example I like to give is, as a basketball coach, I'm really struggling getting my team to improve our shooting. We've hit a plateau. We haven't improved in some time. So I set up a series of drills designed to improve our shooting. The first drill, we have to make 100 shots in 5 minutes. If we do that, we can take a water break and we can move on to the second drill. If we don't do that, we have to run to the end of the court and back. We can't get water and we have to do the drill again. The idea being that the reward will be a motivational or inspirational factor in us working harder to achieve that goal, or that the punishment will be a deterrent from any type of negative behaviors like not working hard or being focused. And again, we'll be motivated to accomplish that short-term goal. I do believe that this can still be an effective leadership style when coaches focus on the rewards aspect. Research shows that athletes respond much better to the opportunity to obtain a reward than the threat of a punishment. And when coaches pair it with another leadership style like transformational leadership, don't just tell your athletes, you've got to make 100 shots in 5 minutes to get a water break. Go do it. Be invested, motivate, inspire, use that, use your communication, use your behaviors, be invested in them getting that reward. That's really strong and important, and a great factor in trying to help transactional leadership be an effective leadership style. The drawback to transactional leadership is it's very inflexible. It's very difficult to change. If you set those standards, expectations, those team rules up front, and the first time your best player misses that third practice or is late to that third practice, you let him or her start the next game. Now you've undermined your credibility as a leader. You've defied your own standard and expectation. Same thing. If I tell the team, we get a water break if we make 100 shots in 5 minutes and we're just not focusing and getting there, so I lower it to 90, now I've undermined my credibility, right? I've made it easier for them and I'm kind of enabling some of those negative behaviors that I was trying to kind of flush out. So again, as a transactional leader, when you set those very clear standards and expectations, you've got to be willing to stick to them or you risk undermining yourself as a leader. So in the last part of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about a question that's really important to me that I ask myself a lot, and I get asked by a lot of coaches, which is, how do I know if my leadership style is working? So for me, I always tell coaches, and I always go back to the questions that we asked ourselves at the beginning. In the example I gave, what are your goals for the team? My goal was for everybody to have fun. In knowing that that was the outcome I wanted to that question, now I can reflect on those intentional leadership decisions that I made during the course of the season. I showed up to practice early, greeted everybody one-on-one and gave them a high five. I tried to give corrections one-on-one whenever possible to build that trust and respect. And then I ended practice with a game so that everybody left on a high note. Those are the intentional leadership decisions I made as a transformational leader. And now I can look at, did the team have fun? Everybody, always seemed excited when I walked up to them at practice and gave them a high five. That leadership behavior seemed to contribute to them having fun. I tried whenever possible to give corrections one-on-one. My athletes seemed to really like that. Over the course of the year, they responded better to it. I think that we really built strong relationships. That seemed like a successful behavior. I ended practice with a game every time. At first, everybody was leaving practice on a high note. But as we got further into the year and it became the same thing over and over, they lost focus. It became unstructured. It got kind of out of control. And it just didn't end up being very fun. And I would become impatient. And it would sometimes end on a not very good note. All right. So that was a leadership decision I made that initially was working, but I needed to realize when it was not, I wasn't having those intended outcomes. I need to be willing and flexible to change it to something else, right? Because that contributed us to not having as much fun. So now I can look cumulatively at those leadership decisions I made and see, did most of my kids generally have fun? Were there a few that didn't? Why do I think they didn't have fun? What else could I have done to maybe build the relationship or give them a little more attention or best meet their needs as a leader so that they had more fun? Ultimately, there's no such thing as a perfect leader, and there's no such thing as a perfect leadership style. There's no set of behaviors I can give you as a leader that are going to guarantee that you're going to be successful. Ultimately, as a leader, you shouldn't judge yourself on did every kid have fun all the time, right? That's not possible. It's not realistic, and it's not what coaches should measure themselves against. That it doesn't mean if you have 10 kids and you think 4 had fun and 6 didn't, that you're a failure as a leader. You're not. You were successful with 4 kids, and that's great. The other ones you weren't as successful. Don't worry. Don't give up. Again, you're making intentional leadership choices. They're not always going to get you to the outcomes that you want. There are plenty of times I look back on my coaching career and I think to myself, I made great leadership decisions. I wouldn't change any of them, but I didn't get the outcomes that I wanted. And there are plenty of other times when I look back and I say, I made terrible leadership decisions that compromised some of my values and beliefs, but I got the outcome I wanted. Ultimately, it's about really focusing on the former, really building your leadership practice and evolving it over time. It's not about those 6 kids that didn't have fun. Those don't make you a failure. That just means that in your leadership practice, you just need to learn from them and make the changes and adjustments that you think are going to best meet their needs to help you get to that goal of them having fun next time. Ultimately, your leadership journey is going to be filled with successes and failures and ups and downs. But again, the defining part is not how many times you failed or succeeded, but simply that you care enough about your athletes and team to keep trying to be a better leader. I think that's what makes a perfect leader to me, is a coach who keeps trying to do everything they can as a leader to best meet the needs of their kids. So the book is Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. You can get it on Amazon and anywhere you get books. And now I'll open it up to questions or thoughts or anything anybody wants to share with us.
You can unmute yourself to ask a question. You could ask a question in chat. Thank you, Matthew. I think you can use this for a lot more than just coaching. A lot of practical life advice in there.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any questions, anybody? All right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Matthew, so much. Really appreciated it. And if you have any questions, you can get in touch with the library. Compliments coming through. Good night, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Matthew.
Thank you.